So I want to ask, which do you guys think is more harmful to the world, government or religion?
And when you say government, what are you talking about?
Well, specifically, I want to focus on the Western governments.
All the Western governments?
Yeah. Do you think there's enough overlap that they're similar
enough? Or as opposed to which governments that, I mean...
I'm just curious if you see enough similarities between all of those.
We just spent a few minutes talking about how, for example, the U.S. government is highly influenced by religion, and that our legislation is very often crafted with huge amounts of religious influence. So even decoupling those two things in the United States is a difficult task.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay, let's just focus on the United States government.
Okay.
So do you guys think do you think that the United States government is more harmful to the world than religion?
In what regard? Like harm, what are we measuring? And I'm not trying to be pedantic here, I just want to know, like, is it more harmful when it comes to, for example, give me an example.
Like, let's say, the protecting human life.
See, I don't, like Tracie said earlier, I don't know that you can separate the two, because our government, as much as systemically it's supposed to be, church-state separation, so much of our government is informed by Judeo-Christian values. So I'm not sure that we can speak of those things as if they're entirely separate. And you think there is a separation there, that we can talk about them as two separate entities?
Yes, because so the government. Okay, so the government and religion, how am I going to say this? They're both faith-based institutions that are meant to control people. So
I guess I'm looking at it like these are extremely complex situations. So for example, let's go back a ways and let's pick like an easy example, something that's a little bit more, there's no such thing as, there's never going to be a black and white example, but let's look at World War II, right? We can pretty much all agree that the genocides that were happening in Germany were not acceptable, and that steps needed to be taken in order to intervene in that. Would we agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like the genocide of
right.
Jewish people.
So it's something that really the globe couldn't just sit back and say, well, that's Germany's decision and whatever they're doing, and sure, they're marching on Poland and they're invading France, but that's up to France and Poland. At some point the world has to say, we're going to take action, and when you have a leader who's not going to listen to diplomacy and insists on basically taking, military response, requires military response, you could easily say that knowing when you go in that you're going in for, at least in part, a humanitarian reason to try and help people and to try and save lives, you are going to necessarily have to kill people and take lives and cause harm. You can't go in, even if you had the best motives in the world, to simply, even if your complete motivation was we want to liberate these poor people being abused, and I'm not saying that anyone's intentions were that pure, but even if they were, you couldn't do that without causing a great deal of harm. Many people died just in the straight up conflict of trying to battle out this war, even if you don't look at the collateral damage, right? Just in soldiers who were involved. And so when you're saying, are they causing harm? It's really hard to answer, because yes, a great deal of harm was caused by going into Germany and by, going up against Japan and by going up against, when the Axis, you're going to have to break eggs to make the omelet. And so, right. We look at things like that, and then you look at things like, for example, the fighting in Jerusalem, where Callie is talking about this intersection of religion and government. And can we say that the damage that's being done by escalation and our decisions on how we handle Israel are not contributing to part of the problem and part of the violence that occurs there? And that would be like this weird intersection of religion and government. I think that there are some situations where government is going to be more clearly acting as a government, And when you were talking about controlling people, my perspective of government by the people is that we are governing ourselves. And you're right, this necessarily means that we're going to have to exert some controls over the population, because otherwise it's chaos. And
I think the other thing to think about is when you ask the question, like, going back to what you said about government being a faith-based institution that's meant to control people, and that makes me wonder, I mean, are we talking about government as a concept, or are we talking about specific implementations of that concept? And I don't, again, I think we have to examine the question, I think we have to examine the definition a little more closely than that, because we can talk about the governing systems of indigenous peoples versus the government of the United States. And I don't, aside from the fact that we're talking about a person or a group of people that has authority, I don't know that we can compare those as the same thing as this nebulous term of government.
I mean, in the end, I feel like unable to give you a satisfactory answer to that question, because I feel like the question is a simple question to a very complicated issue. I think that government in the United States and government in other countries certainly does cause harm, and sometimes even causes harm in a quest to do good. Because there's always going to be two sides to everything. Someone's going to be imposed upon and harmed in a way whenever you're, serving other populations. But in the same way, I mean, religion is integrated into the government, and religion causes its own brand of harm. Like Callie was talking earlier about the harm that's perpetrated on the trans community by religious models of relationships and gender and existence of this system that they see as a relationship model that has to be conformed to, and anybody that doesn't conform is actively oppressed, with them literally trying to use legislation, use the laws, use the government in order to enact that. So is that religion causing harm, or is that government causing harm because it's being used as the tool of religion? It's a complicated issue.
Right.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Cool. I guess what I'm saying is, okay, so the U.S. government can cause good, and they can do bad things, like the invasion of Iraq or Libya and Syria, and or just the invasion of the Middle East in general, where they basically killed all these people to steal oil. And they can also do good things like provide Social Security for their citizens and things like welfare, job security, and stuff like that. But I guess what I'm saying is, I feel like the governments are way more of a threat to the human race because of the fact that just this escalation of empire and military conquest have brought us to a point to where if we go any further, we could be talking about nuclear war. And that could very well be the end of our people, of the entire human race.
See, I'm not sure that I disagree with pretty much anything you said there, but what it comes back to for me is you asked this question about the harm of government, and I don't know that any of the things that you described are necessarily outcroppings of the institution of government itself. It's what people have decided they want to do with that institution, not the institution itself. Does that make sense?
It does, but the thing is that the people who are making these decisions, it's not the everyday person. It's not like I or you or me were like, okay, yeah, let's go into Iraq and kill all these people. Or it was,
I'm going to have to say that this is getting far too complicated in scope for the atheist experience. And part of the reason is I think that there's a lot that can be done to criticize governance and government. I don't know that a comparison to religious harm is actually useful or helpful. I think that we agree that government can be used as a tool for good or a tool for harm. And I think that religion can be used in some cases as a tool for good. For example, religious charities that are actually helpful, or people who go to liberal churches that support food banks and things like that. And it can also be guilty of horrible harm, like with regards to the oppression that we were talking about earlier. I don't think that we disagree that both institutions are capable of being used as a tool for good ends or harmful ends, but I'm not sure that this show is the place that we're going to resolve. I don't even know that the question of which is worse is resolvable based on our capacity to measure.
What do you mean by that?
It's almost like when they say, did the Russians affect the election? Right? So there's no way to measure. When you're talking about influence exerted through media, can we really measure how much somebody was influenced by particular articles that they may or may not have seen? So there's no way to know if they influenced the election. So all we can do is kind of shrug and say that's something we can't measure because we don't have the skill set and the knowledge to measure a thing like that. And with this, I certainly don't have the skill set to measure, like to go through and tally the harm and the good caused by government, in the U.S. government and religion in the U.S. or globally or whatever we're talking, and then come to some quantitative decision about which is more harmful. I don't have that capacity.
Yeah, I think it becomes kind of an infinite regression of defining concepts. So when we say government, what do we mean by that? When we say religion, what do we mean by that? Because I mean, even that word itself means a million different things depending on who you're talking to. So I think what I think the issue is that the scope of the question isn't specific enough to even really be able to have an answer, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I just wanted to pick your guys' brain about it a little because.
Fair.
I mean, well, because the thing is, I don't know. Well, so are you familiar with Matt Dillahunty and his?
I have heard of him.
What was it? His. Yeah, but he gave like a presentation about the superiority of secular morality.
Okay.
And okay, first I have to ask: would you agree that you have a secular moral system?
I would say yes. My views are informed by my morality and the evidence.
Yeah, many atheists are humanists, and that would be a secular, a moral system that can be secular. But,
okay, well, I don't understand how can you say that your morality is superior? But I mean, many atheists.
We're moving into other questions. We have other callers, and we've addressed the question that you called to ask. And I understand you have more questions, but the show has a limited time span. So I do have other callers that are waiting, and I'm willing to fully admit that we don't have an answer to the question that you originally posed. And I think before we start getting into the list of questions, we really have to show some regard for the rest of the callers that are waiting. Does that? I mean, I don't.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Okay.
Can I call back like next week?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free. I think that's a great idea. In fact, feel free to call back and discuss the moral question. It comes up often, and I think we'd be happy to talk to you about it. But I think today we kind of spent a lot of time on a question that's unanswerable. And but it's not a bad question. It was just maybe too much to chew. So I really appreciate you calling in, Stephen. Or I think it's Stephan. Sorry. Thank you.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
Bye bye.